What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we have the much anticipated top 10 peaks in NBA history, a video that was widely requested. Now like with any top 10 list or top 10 video, I want to put this disclaimer out there. Me personally, I prefer the tier ranking list. I think top 10 lists can be very deceiving. For instance, you can have a player ranked as the 9th best player of all time, but you could argue he's the 4th or 5th best player of all time, and ranking him at number 9 does not show how close he is to being a top 5 player. So I hope when you're watching this video, everyone understands all of these players are great players, and you have to nitpick each little aspect of their games, as well as their accomplishments, their awards, and how they played in the playoffs, as well as the finals. It's very, very difficult to narrow this down to a top 10 list. And at the end of the day, this is my personal list, and I have my own personal criteria. And here is that criteria. First off, I have individual dominance and how great these players were as individuals. Second, I have how good these players were on both ends of the court. In this video, we're basically trying to find which players in NBA history have the fewest flaws. And you have to look at which players are great on defense as well as great on offense. And if some player on this list is a great defender, but an average offensive player, they will be ranked lower than someone who's great on both ends of the floor. Also, as always, I think their impact on winning is a huge factor in this video. Averaging 35 points per game on a 20-win team will always be less valuable than averaging 28 on a 60-win team. I think that's common sense, and I think winning will always be a factor in these type of videos. Now the next two things I have on this list kind of go hand in hand. That is how good they are in the playoffs and how good they are in the finals. The playoffs, as always, are where it matters most, and the finals are the biggest stage. Which players rise to the occasion and take their game to another level, and which players stay average or which players get worse depending on how big the stage is. Now the last two things are also interchangeable, and that is individual accolades as well as competition faced. I think level of competition is a huge influence on awards, accolades, and things like that, and a player who faced tougher competition and beat that competition will always have the edge in my opinion. So that right there is my quick criteria list. Whether you agree or disagree with my criteria, that's another story, but just know that is my criteria for this top 10 list. And the last two things I have to say before this video starts is that when looking at these players' peaks, I'm going to be doing a 5-year peak. I think 5 years is a good number. You get a grasp of how good these players were. It's a very good sample size. And the last thing I have to say is the only active player I included was LeBron James, as LeBron is one of the only active players who is worthy of being top 10, and I think guys like Kevin Durant and Steph Curry, their careers are not over yet, so I don't think it's fair to them to include them in this video. Now I have a strong feeling this video is going to be very, very long, so without wasting any more time, let's finally get in the top 10 peaks in NBA history. At number 10, I have Magic Johnson, the greatest point guard in NBA history, and Magic's peak was from 1985 till 1989, and you can see how good he was at his peak, averaging 20.7 points per game, 12.4 assists, 6.5 boards on 52, 26, and 86 splits. And during this time, Magic was one of, if not the best player in the NBA. He was the best point guard, the best passer, a top tier leader, and had one of the highest basketball IQs in NBA history. And Magic was the engine for the Showtime Lakers, one of the most dominant teams in NBA history. On your right, you can see the Lakers' record during this stretch. Winning 62 games was considered an average year for that Lakers team, and Magic had a profound impact on the Lakers being so dominant. Now when it came to playoffs, Magic and the Lakers were also extremely dominant. During this stretch, he averaged 19.8 points per game, 13.3 assists, 6.6 boards on 52, 26, and 84 splits. You can see what he averaged in the finals, and when comparing his final stats to his playoff stats, it's fairly even, and I think I might even give the edge to his final stats. And that's one very important thing to note. Magic, there was no drop-off in performance from the playoffs to the overall finals. And at this time, like I said before, this Lakers team was a buzzsaw running through the NBA. During this 5-year stretch, they had a 64-25 record. That's absolutely insane for a team during a 5-year stretch. Now that right there was the overall view of how good Magic was, but I really want to focus in on his greatest playoff run, that is the 1987 playoffs. In this playoff run, Magic averaged 21.8 points per game, a career high, 12.12 assists, which led the NBA, 7.7 boards on 54, 20, and 83 splits. So at this time, Magic, he was a great scorer, a great passer, as well as a great rebounder, and a triple-double threat every single night. And if you go through Magic's career, specifically his later career when Kareem was older, the Lakers asked him to score more, and I think in the '87 finals, that was on full display, as on your right you can see Magic averaged 26, 13, 8 on ridiculous 54, 50, and 96 splits. So during the '87 playoff run, Magic was asked to score more, he was still the best passer on the team, and he was still a great rebounder. And that Lakers team led by Magic had a 15-3 record, and they won the championship. Now all of that right there was how great Magic was during his peak. But like with every player, you have to talk about the negatives. And the big negatives I noticed with Magic are three specific things. The first one is his ability to create his own shot late in games. Magic, at this point in his career, he was a better clutch time player than he was early in his career, but still, he wasn't a great clutch time performer. Yes, he had some game winners in the finals, but overall Magic, you couldn't ask him to get a bucket for you at the end of games, and he had to develop that skill over time, but he still wasn't an elite shot creator at his peak. And with that being said, Magic, he was still a great facilitator, and he could find open guys late in games, but if you're looking for a player to make that game-winning shot, Magic Johnson, more times than not, is not the guy you're giving the ball to. Now the second thing I have to point out is Magic's defense. Magic at no point in his career was a great defender, and at some points, he was a below average defender. At his peak, I would say he was an average defender. His size really helped him with smaller guards, but his mobility and quickness, it was average on defense. And this Lakers team in general wasn't a defensive-minded team, so Magic's defensive weaknesses, they were kind of hidden by these Showtime Lakers and their fast-paced offense. And the last thing I have to point out is the playoff competition Magic faced. During this 5-year run, Magic only beat one 60-win team, and they only beat a total of 6 50-win teams. And as we'll come to see with some other NBA legends, that number is staggeringly low, and the Western Conference in the 80s is one of the weakest conferences in NBA history. Now with all that being said, Magic still had a great peak, and that's why I ranked Magic as the 10th best peak in NBA history. Now moving on to number 9, we have Magic's big time rival, and that is Larry Joe Bird. And Larry Bird's peak was from 1984 till 1988. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that Larry Bird is one of the most skilled players of all time. And Larry Bird's skill, in my opinion, is top 5 at the worst, and he's one of the best fundamentally sound players in NBA history. Now when looking at his peak, looking at his regular season numbers, this guy averaged 27 points per game, nearly 10 boards and 7 assists on ridiculous 51, 40, and 89.9 splits. He's 0.1% away from averaging 54, 90 over a 5-year stretch. That right there was absolutely insane. And during this 5-year run, Larry was a 3-time MVP, all those being consecutive, and looking at his MVP finishes, first, third, and second. There was no year during this time where Larry Bird wasn't a top 3 MVP candidate, and he was top 2 for 4 out of these 5 years. That just shows how good Larry was, bringing his best to the court every single night. And just getting back to Larry's efficiency during this run, in 1987, he had the first ever 54-90 season. That was while averaging 28 points per game. And during this run, he led the NBA in free throw shooting 3 different times and shot over 40% from 3 4 times. And if you want to get a very good idea of how good Larry was at his peak, I would say look at the 1984 playoff run. In this run, Larry averaged 27.5 points per game, 11.0 boards, 5.9 assists on ridiculous 52, 41, and 88 splits. And if you think that's impressive, look at how he played in the finals versus the Showtime Lakers. He averaged 27.4 points per game, 14.0 boards, 3.5 assists on 48, 67, and 84 splits. And he led his team to the NBA title. Now getting back to how good he was overall, this version of Larry Bird is the best two-way version. He actually made one all-defensive team. He wasn't a great defender, but his basketball IQ, it allowed him to appear much better than he was at defense. He was quick at reading plays, getting in passing lanes, just tipping the ball out and causing a lot of disruption. And Larry Bird, he wasn't a guy who took 30 shots a game. He could take 12 shots and still be the best player on the court by far. And I think that goes to show how good of an all-around player he was and how huge his impact was on his teammates. And basketball has always and will always be a skill-based game, and Larry Bird was one of the most skilled players the game's ever seen, and his lack of athletic ability did not prevent him from being one of the greatest players of all time. That's why I have him as the 9th best peak in NBA history. Now up next, number 8, we have the late great Wilt Chamberlain. And Wilt, as you guys know, is one of the most dominant players in NBA history. And back when he played in the 60s, he was a mythical figure larger than life. And a lot of people didn't get to see Wilt in person, so it was word of mouth, and he was looked at as some kind of godlike figure who had athletic ability that nobody had ever seen. And if you go back and watch the tape, watch the film, it's very hard to find full games, but you can go find them if you dig. You can see Wilt on the court. He doesn't look like he's from the same era as some of the guys he's playing. And that's not a knock on Wilt's competition. That just shows you guys how far ahead Wilt was of his time. He was basically an alien playing against average humans back in the day. And if you transported that version of Wilt into the NBA today, I guarantee you he would still be a top athlete even for today's players. And Wilt's peak was from 1960 to 1964. And during this time, Wilt put up some godlike numbers. During this 5-year stretch, he averaged 41.7 points per game, 25.3 boards, 3.0 assists, on 50.6% shooting. And the one thing that really caught my eye when looking at these Wilt seasons, look at this 5-year stretch from Wilt. He averaged 37.6 points per game, 38.4 points per game, 50.4 points per game, which is still ridiculous, 44.8 points per game, and 36.9 points per game. So Wilt's worst year during this stretch was when he averaged 36.9 points per game. That should be some great perspective on how dominant offensive player Wilt Chamberlain was. Also, how durable he was during this time. During that stretch, he played an average of 47.3 minutes per game. For a 5-year run, he was nearly playing the entire game. So Wilt was definitely an athletic marvel. Now, things I do want to look at is how Wilt played in the playoffs. For this 5-year stretch, he averaged 34.6 points per game, 25.6 boards, 2.8 assists, on 49.9% shooting from the field, and 53% shooting from the line. And once again, I don't want to downplay Wilt's era or his competition, but I will say it's a known fact that during this era, the stats are pretty inflated, and that's due to the high pace as well as the high amount of shot attempts. Now, one thing I will say in Wilt's defense, stats at this time were much more strict, especially with assists. When you pass the ball to someone, it had to be almost an immediate shot. There was no 2 dribbles, gather step, hop step, and then make the layup, and you get the assist. It was a very, very strict time for assist counting. And also, one of the disadvantages of this era, we don't have access to his defensive numbers like his steals and blocks, and Wilt's defensive impact, it goes overlooked because how great of an offensive player he was. Now, the one thing that will always hold me back with Wilt is the overall notion that he was a stat padder and he was out for himself. You can go back and read numerous articles of people during this time saying that Wilt was all in it for himself and to get gaudy numbers. Now, like with any story, there was a little bit of truth and a little bit of embellishment, but I do think in general Wilt, his stats and his numbers, they could be greatly inflated due to his playstyle and his team construction as well as his era. Now, I don't want to leave Wilt off on a sour note, so I'll end it with this. During this 5-year stretch, he had 97 games of 50-plus points. That would be the most ever in NBA history. And in 1962, Wilt's 50-point game season, his lowest scoring game was 26 points. And he only scored lower than 30 points twice during that year. So Wilt Chamberlain was definitely one of a kind, and he had one of the highest peaks in NBA history. That's why I ranked him at number 8. Now at number 7, I have one of the other great big men in NBA history, and that is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Kareem's peak was from 1970 to 1974. And this is actually the first 4 years of Kareem's career, as he spent 4 years before that at UCLA. So he really came to the NBA as a finished product and a very polished player. And at this time, Kareem had tremendous athletic ability. You can go back and watch the highlights. He was moving on the court almost like a guard, and his defensive impact as well as his wingspan and his overall play on both ends of the court was tremendous during this time. One of the best all-around bigs the game has ever seen. And for this stretch, Kareem had some very impressive numbers, averaging 30.5 points per game, 15.5 boards, 4.3 assists, 1.4 steals, 3.5 blocks, on 55% shooting. 5-time All-NBA member, a 2-time scoring champion, and a 3-time MVP. And if you look at on your right how he played in the playoffs, it was still very similar to how he was in the regular season. he averaged 29.7 points per game, 16.8 boards, 4.0 assists, 2.4 blocks, 1.3 steals on 51% shooting. So he was still playing at a very, very high level during the playoffs. And one thing I want to point out is how great Kareem was in the finals for these Bucks teams. He appeared in 2 finals in 1971 and 1974, and collectively, he averaged 30.5 points per game, 14.5 boards, 4.5 assists, on 54.7% shooting, 71% from the line, and 2.1 blocks. And you have to give some perspective, at this point Kareem was in his 2nd and 5th year in the NBA. So for pro standards, he was still relatively young and inexperienced. But despite that, he came into the league off the bat in his 2nd year and won a championship with a Bucks team that had never been a winner. And I think Kareem's years in Milwaukee get overlooked tremendously. People don't realize how great he was for that Bucks team, as I think that is the best version of Kareem, and people look at the titles he won in LA, and they kind of forget about how dominant he was in Milwaukee. And at this point, the NBA was kind of in a transition period. They were going from the old NBA of Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain into the new NBA of Kareem and Dr. J. But still, at this point, Kareem was playing some all-time great bigs at his position. Of course, he was playing Wilt Chamberlain, as well as Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, Dave Cowens, Nate Thurmond, as well as Willis Reed. And the one negative that did stand out to me was the competition this Bucks team faced. In the 71 finals, they weren't playing against some all-time great Baltimore Bullets team. That team only won 42 games, and during this stretch, they only beat 2 50-win teams. A very, very staggering number. But when you look at Kareem as the basketball player, him individually, it's very hard to find a weakness with his game. I would say his outside shooting at this point was not great. He still had the hook shot, but you have to remember at this point in time, there was no three-point shot, there was no emphasis on outside shooting, and it was a big man game dominated in the paint, and Kareem was as dominant as anyone the game had ever seen. I think free throw shooting is a rightful concern. His passing as a big man was really ahead of its time, and like I said, Milwaukee Kareem, he looked like a 7-foot guard running around the court. So that's why I have Kareem at the number 7 spot. Now next up, number 6, we have the big fundamental Tim Duncan. And Duncan's peak was from 2001 till 2005, and during this stretch, he averaged 22.8 points per game, 12.3 boards, 3.3 assists, with 2.6 blocks a game, while shooting 50% from the field and 68% from the line. And Duncan's defensive impact at this time was as high as it's ever been. He was a lockdown defender at the power forward position, and his impact in the paint, as well as in the pick and roll, and just switching and helping off players was an immense help to those Spurs teams, and he was the backbone for that Spurs team winning those championships on offense as well as defense. And during this time, Duncan was a 5-time All-NBA first team member, being 4-time All-Defensive first team, and a 2-time block leader, and a 2-time MVP. And he was doing that in an era that featured some of the best power forwards in NBA history, Chris Webber, Kevin Garnett, as well as Dirk. And he was competing with all 3 of those guys for those first team All-NBA bids. Now, one thing that is very, very interesting to note is how good Duncan was in the playoffs, averaging 24.3 points per game, 13.7 boards, 4.0 assists, with 2.8 blocks on 49% shooting from the field and 69.6% shooting from the free throw line. And the biggest takeaway from Duncan in the playoffs has to be his 2003 playoff run, a legendary playoff run where he carried a San Antonio Spurs team that was good but not great to a championship. And during that run, they beat some all-time great teams. You have the Shaq and Kobe Lakers, Amari Stoudemire's Suns, as well as Dirk's Mavs, and in the finals, Jason Kidd's Nets. Now for that 03 playoff run, Duncan once again had superb numbers, 24.7 points per game, 15.4 boards, 5.3 assists, 3.5 blocks on 52% shooting from the field, and he led that Spurs team in points, rebounds, assists, as well as blocks during this playoff run. So once again, Duncan in the finals is great all around and brings it on both ends of the court. And if you go back and watch those final series, it really was a grinded out game for Duncan as well as that Spurs team. The early 2000s was one of the slowest paced eras of all time, and in my opinion, the best defensive era in NBA history, and Duncan was dominating that era. And if you want to look at Duncan's best competition during this stretch, he beat 2 teams that won 60 plus games and 5 teams that won 50 plus games. And like always, Tim Duncan was a great leader, unspoken, but still had a huge impact on the Spurs teams. He was the best power forward in the NBA, and in my opinion, he was the best player in the NBA for a couple of years during this stretch. And if you haven't watched Duncan's play during this 5-year stretch, you'll be pretty surprised to notice he's actually a pretty good athlete, and his shot blocking ability was really enhanced due to that athletic ability. Later on in the 2010s, he was still a mobile defender, but he didn't have that burst and that vertical to block shots like he did in 2003, and just his defensive range and his impact was immense during this 5-year stretch. So because of Duncan's great play on both ends of the court, I have to rank him as the 6th best peak in NBA history. Now, finally getting the top 5, the first player we have is the late great Kobe Bryant. And Kobe's peak, I would say, from 2006 till 2010. And this version of Kobe was the more experienced version and the smarter player. And I think his all-around game was at an all-time high during this 5-year stretch. And if you look at his numbers during the regular season, he averaged 29.8 points per game, 5.6 boards, 5.0 assists on 46, 35, and 85 splits. So for someone who's labeled an inefficient player, this version of Kobe was giving you 35 and 5 on extremely good shooting splits while being a high volume player. And the one thing that will always impress me with Kobe is how his playoff production does not drop off in the slightest. And if anything, it actually gets better. During this stretch in the playoffs, on your right, you can see he averaged 29.8 points per game, 5.7 boards, 5.4 assists on 47, 35, and 84 splits. So there was absolutely no drop off. Now the next thing I want to look at is Kobe's great play during the 2009 playoffs. During this run, he averaged 30.2 points per game, 5.5 assists, 5.3 boards on 46, 35, and 88 splits. And in the finals, he had his best finals series ever, averaging 32.4 points per game, 7.4 assists, 5.6 boards on 43, 36, and 84 splits. And he was able to win his first ever Finals MVP without one Shaquille O'Neal. And I think this 5-year stretch was a critical part of Kobe's career to show he could be successful without Shaq. That was a big narrative writing Kobe for this entire stretch until he won that championship in 2009. Now the one thing that gives Kobe an edge over a lot of the other great players is the competition he faced in this Western Conference. During this run, Kobe's Lakers beat 10 50-win teams. I'll repeat that, 10 50-win teams. The majority of those coming in the 2009 and 2010 playoffs. I'll touch on one last thing. Kobe's 2006 season, scoring-wise, is probably a top 2, if not the best scoring year of all time, given the pace of play as well as teammates and all the other factors going into it. Kobe that year averaged 35.4 points a game, had numerous 40-point game streaks and high-scoring games in the 60s, and had countless games scoring 50-plus points. And I think during the 2006 season, that carry job he had of that Lakers team, that was not a good Lakers team by any means, is one of the more impressive things about Kobe's career when looking at his non-championship seasons. Now the last thing I'll talk about with Kobe is how good he was as an all-around basketball player. People always talk about Kobe as just a scorer and a score-first player. And yes, I will agree Kobe scoring was his best ability, but still, he was a very good passer and a high IQ basketball player. Yes, he would take bad shots at some points, but by this time in his career, he was a much smarter player. And I think that experience combined with Kobe being one of the most skilled players of all time makes him come in easily at the number 5 spot on my list. Now next up, number 4, we have one of the greatest centers in NBA history, and that is Hakeem the Dream. And Hakeem's peak was from 93 till 97. And when talking about Hakeem, you automatically have to look at how great he was on both ends of the court. It's almost kind of comical how great a defender Hakeem was. You could argue he's the best defender of all time. Go back and watch those games. His athletic ability, his overall understanding of defenses, his shot blocking skills were second to none. I mean, this guy was an offensive force, and his defensive impact was still on the level of someone like Dikembe Mutombo, who really only focused on defense. So Hakeem being an elite offensive player while still being a dominant defensive player, that's extremely impressive, and that's one of the huge reasons I have him at the number 4 spot. Now if you want to look at this from a stats angle and look at Hakeem's numbers, as always they are very impressive. During his 5-year peak, he averaged 26, 11, and 3 with 1.7 steals and 3.3 blocks on 52% shooting. And if you look at his playoff production, it's also very similar, averaging 27, 11, and 4 on 53% shooting with 3.3 blocks. And HAKEEM during this time was a 5-time All-NBA first team member and a 4-time All-Defensive member and a 1-time block leader. And he was doing that in the mid-90s against the best centers in NBA history. You have guys like Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, Alonzo Mourning, Dikembe Mutombo, even power forwards like Charles Barkley as well as Karl Malone. The big man position was absolutely stacked at this point in time, and HAKEEM was head and shoulders above all those players. Now, also a big thing when looking at HAKEEM's peak is how good he was at carrying those Rockets teams. His best championship run, stats-wise, was a 95 playoff run. He averaged 33, 10, and 4 with 2.8 blocks on 53% shooting. And if you look at the teams he beat during this 5-year stretch, he beat 7 50-win teams and 2 60-win teams for a total of 9 teams that won 50-plus games. And keep in mind, he was doing that with a team that was a below-average supporting cast. Now, when it comes to HAKEEM, the basketball player, looking at him as an individual, what can you say that hasn't already been said? A dominant two-way player, a dominant defender. His skills in the post were unmatched. He set the blueprint for all the big men who came after him. His spin moves, his up fakes, his ball fakes, they're just ahead of his time, and still to this day, they're amazing to watch. Now, the only flaw I can find in HAKEEM's game that really isn't even his fault is outside shooting. In the 90s as well as the 80s, three-point shooting was not stressed, so HAKEEM was simply not asked to shoot outside jump shots. He had a nice mid-range shot as well as a nice fadeaway, even a fadeaway bank shot that he developed over time. So if he was born today in the 2000s, he would have a three-point shot, but since he was in the 90s, he simply was not asked to do that. And the last thing I'll say about HAKEEM is that he won 2 championships back-to-back, and they really get overlooked by other players as well as the other great dynasty of that time. And the 94-95 Rockets, they were good teams, but HAKEEM Olajuwon made them great teams. So that's why I have HAKEEM's peak at the number 4 spot. Now next up at number 3, I have the big Aristotle, that is Shaquille O'Neal. And Shaquille's peak was from 98 till 2002. And Shaq, from a sports perspective, not just basketball, he's a physical anomaly that we'll probably never see again. This guy in his prime, he was 7'1", nearly 330 pounds, and just a dominant force in the paint. There's always that one mixtape of him just dunking on players, and he makes a 10-foot goal look like a little Tykes rim at a preschool. During this 5-year stretch, he was averaging 28, 12, and 3 on 58% shooting. That on its own is very impressive, and the playoff numbers are also very impressive, averaging 30, 14, and 3 with 2.5 blocks on 56% shooting. And if you know anything about Shaq, he was a really fun-loving guy. He didn't take that many things seriously. He took basketball serious for the time being. I think at this point in time, Shaq was locked in as being a great basketball player. And during the stretch, at worst, he was a top 3 player, and at his best, he was by far the best player in the entire NBA. Now, like with Kobe as well as Tim Duncan, Shaq's teams faced some all-time great competition. And during this run, Shaq's Lakers teams beat 12 50-win teams, including 2 60-win teams in the tough Western Conference. And I keep coming back to this, but the Western Conference in the early 2000s was one of the toughest conferences in NBA history, and for a guy like Shaq to lead his team to 3 straight championships in that era, that really is something very, very special. And I think the peak of Shaq's powers was the 2000 playoff run. During this run, Shaq averaged 30.7 points per game, 15.4 boards, 3.1 assists on 56% shooting with 2.4 blocks. And he led the playoffs in scoring as well as rebounds. And the most impressive thing from this run is how he played in the finals, averaging 38 points per game, 16.7 boards, 2.7 blocks, 2.3 assists on a ridiculous 61% shooting. And those Lakers teams in the early 2000s, they were an absolute buzzsaw, running through the Western Conference and just dominating the East in the finals. And when you have someone like Shaq who's so dominant, combined with a young Kobe, you're guaranteed to win some championships, but winning 3 in a row is still a very, very unprecedented feat. Now, when looking at Shaq the basketball player and looking at how dominant he was, I've talked about his physical abilities, But one thing that gets overlooked is how good a passer he was, and the fact that he had some pretty good go-to moves that were primarily based on skill. You can go back and watch these games. He had jump hook shots, floaters, he had a little bit of a turnaround shot. If he got you in the post overplaying you, he would backspin on you and catch the alley-oop. I mean, Shaq wasn't the most skilled player, I'm not saying he was, but acting like he had no skill and just dominant off physical force, that's simply not true, because Shaq at the end of the day was still a great basketball player, not just a great athlete. And one of the things that really shows how great a basketball player Shaq was his passing out of double teams. At this time, the 2000s, the paint was always clogged, the spacing was terrible, it still was a big man's game, and it was the dead ball era. And Shaq was dominant in a league and an NBA in time that was focused purely on the paint and scoring from the low post. So I think that adds extra bonus points to how Shaq dominated in the era he dominated. And I will end it on saying Shaq's flaws, and his one fatal flaw is free throw shooting. It's really his Achilles heel to an overall dominant player. Also, late game shooting, Shaq, he was never really the go-to player in the clutch, and you really can't remember any game-winning shots he had because usually he wasn't asked to take those shots. But at the end of the day, he is a big man, and you can't ask him to shoot 35-foot threes or shoot fadeaway game-winning jump shots. So that is why I have Shaq's peak at the number 3 spot. So now finally we're in the top 2, and at number 2 I have LeBron James. And LeBron's peaks from 2012 to 2016. And I think that 5-year stretch is LeBron's best all-around play, and I think when he was in Miami, that was the best two-way version of LeBron James, and later on in Cleveland, his basketball IQ as well as his passing, and just his overall championship experience, that also helped him be a tremendously great player. And when looking at LeBron's stats for this 5-year stretch, LeBron averaged 26.3 points per game, 7.3 boards, 6.8 assists on 53, 36, and 74 splits. But what really makes LeBron James a great player, and what makes this version of LeBron James a great player, is how good he was in the playoffs. Averaging 28 points per game, 9.2 boards, 6.6 assists on 49, 32, and 75 splits. And during these 5 years, LeBron James, he really did evolve his game and became a much smarter player. Winning those 2 championships in Miami was vital to his career, and he was very good in both those playoff runs. He came up big in Game 7 in 2013, and also in 2012, he had some big-time plays down the stretch. And LeBron is actually the only player on this list to make a finals every year of his 5-year peak. And I'll put each of those finals series on the screen right now, and you can look at LeBron's body of work in the finals. It's pretty astounding. His worst overall series, he still averaged 25, 11, and 7. And you also have years like 2015, where he carried a Cavaliers team to 6 games versus the Warriors, averaging 36 points per game, 13.3 boards, and 8.8 assists. And of course, his most iconic series in 2016, where he took down the 73-9 Warriors, and in that series he is once again phenomenal, averaging 29.7 points per game, 11.3 boards, 8.9 assists on 49, 37, and 73 splits. And one thing I want to focus in on is the last 3 games of that 3-1 comeback. In Game 5, LeBron James had 41 points, 16 boards, and 7 assists on 53% shooting. In Game 6, also had 41 points, 11 assists, and 8 boards on 59% shooting. In that vital Game 7, the do-or-die game, which really elevated LeBron's legacy, he had 27 points, 11 assists, and 11 boards on 38% shooting. And I cannot leave out the iconic block on Andre Iguodala that really swung the momentum of that game. Now, I want to get back to looking at LeBron as an overall basketball player, not just the stats. The stats are great, but these numbers don't do LeBron justice, especially Miami LeBron. His numbers are actually kind of underwhelming for how dominant he was. As a two-way player, this guy could really guard 1 through 4, and if he had to, he could guard the small ball 5. And if you go back and watch some of those plays, LeBron athletically was his absolute peak. He'd packed on a lot of muscle since he left Cleveland, and he was just a physical anomaly at that point. And similar to Shaq, I don't want to make LeBron seem like just some physical athlete. LeBron James is a very, very skilled basketball player, and in some people's minds, a top 5 skilled player of all time. Of course, you have the passing ability, which is always great, the high IQ plays, but the one thing that really impressed me is how LeBron has evolved as a jump shooter. Early on in his career, especially in the finals versus the better teams, they would force him to take outside jump shots. But after his time in Miami, he really did improve that jump shot, and and even had years shooting 40% from 3, and his efficiency during that time was absolutely insane. And the last thing I'll say about LeBron's peak, he was playing in the Eastern Conference, which wasn't the toughest conference ever. It was probably one of the weaker conferences. It wasn't as weak as the early 2000s, but it definitely was a weak conference. With that being said, LeBron, he did dominate the East, and he won 3 championships versus Western Conference teams. And the only flaw I could point to in LeBron's game has to deal with his early time in Miami. He was kind of reluctant to shoot game winners and be a good clutch time player, but like I said, he evolved, and by the time he got to Cleveland, he was a very, very good clutch player. So all of that is why I say LeBron James has the second greatest peak of all time. Now with the number 1 spot, I'm pretty sure it's no secret. The player with the greatest peak of all time is none other than Michael Jordan. And his 5-year peak was 1989 till 1993. And like with all these players, you can look at his regular season stats and see they're absolutely amazing. The thing that will always impress me with Jordan is how he elevated his play come playoff time. And in the middle column, you'll see Jordan's stats in the playoffs, averaging 34.4 points per game, 6.8 assists, 6.7 boards on 50, 35, and 83 splits. But what makes it even better and even more impressive is how Jordan upped his game in the finals, averaging 36 points per game, 7.9 assists, 6.6 boards on 52, 42, and 80 splits. So look at those 3 columns. Jordan progressively gets better the deeper he advances in the season. That's something you really cannot say about any player on this list. Yes, players on this list have the same level of play, but not many, if any, players go up at all 3 levels throughout NBA history. Now, I'm also during this stretch Jordan looking at the accolades side of it. 5-time All-NBA member, 5-time All-Defensive First Team, 5-time scoring leader, and a 2-time steals leader, and he won MVP twice. But even more impressive than that is the competition Jordan faced. During this 5-year stretch, Jordan's Bulls teams beat 11 teams that won 50-plus games. And Jordan's Bulls teams three-peated during this era in a tough Eastern Conference. And three-peating is always hard, and making it a numerous finals appearances, that is always a difficult accomplishment. But very similar to Shaq as well as Kobe, when you're playing in a difficult conference, that makes those accomplishments even more special. Now looking at Jordan, the basketball player, at this point, he was at his peak athletic ability. He was gliding on the court, flying through the air, dunking on you, over you, or even through you. He was the best scorer in the league, a top 5 defender, a great on-ball player, a great off-ball player. He could actually shoot the 3-point shot, which you saw in those stats. And he was one of, if not the best mid-range shooters in NBA history. And if you wanted to find a flaw in Jordan's game, it's very difficult to find. 3-point shooting, like I said, was not a flaw at this point, as Jordan was shooting 35% from 3 for the playoffs and shooting upwards of 40% in the finals. His defense, like I said, he was a great defender. On ball, he could lock anyone up, and off ball, he was great at reading passes and getting the passing lanes and getting fast break dunks. So for me personally, when evaluating this version of Michael Jordan, the flaws in his game, I see very little, if any, and I don't think he has any major flaws. Something, once again, that separates him from every other player on this list. Now, I've made numerous videos on Jordan's peak and his great playoff runs, the 93 run, the 91 run, as well as the 92 run. And right now, I'll just put all of Jordan's playoff run stats on the screen right now. Each of those 5 playoff runs, look at how dominant each of those 5 runs are. Look at the 89 run, averaging 34, 7, and 7. The 91 run, averaging 34, 8, and 6. The 93 run, averaging 35, 6, and 7. I mean, that is the peak of basketball right there at that point. And in my opinion, I don't think we'll ever see another player dominate like Michael Jordan did during that 5-year stretch. So that's why I have Michael Jordan at the number 1 spot on the greatest peaks in NBA history. Now that was finally the last part of this video. I hope you watched the very end of this video. If you just skimmed through it, I also appreciate that. And if you look at my final list, going in order from last to first, at number 10 we have Magic, at number 9 we have Larry Bird, at number 8 Wilt, number 7 Kareem, number 6 Tim Duncan, number 5 Kobe, number 4 Hakeem, number 3 Shaq, number 2 LeBron, and number 1 Jordan. So like I said before, all these players are great players, 99 overalls, and the top 0.00001% of all NBA players. So please don't get mad at this list. You have to split hairs, you have to nitpick when ranking the greatest peaks of all time. So with all that being said, this video has been very long. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.